I'm Filipina Wouters, Communications and Marketing Director at the International Pole Line Foundation, and I'd like to tell you more on how we can reimagine tuna. Reimagine Tuna brings such an opportunity, and we thank you for joining us so that we can tell you more about this exciting initiative. With approximately 800 million people dependent upon fisheries and aquaculture for their livelihoods around the world, the global seafood industry has a clear responsibility to deliver upon the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The SDGs, through their holistic vision to eradicate poverty and deprivation, grow economies, protect the environment, advance peace and promote good governance, provide the ideal framework to support responsible fisheries. Tuna is a global commodity that is consumed in high-end markets as steaks, sushi, sashimi and poke, but is also a very important affordable source of protein for many coastal communities in developing countries. The global pandemic has had a profound impact on tuna markets and the fisheries that supply them. Initial panic buying of canned tuna led to an increase in demand for products with a long shelf life. On the other hand, with the closure of restaurants and disruption in transport logistics, fresh frozen tuna markets collapsed overnight. The impact of these disruptions has been felt more acutely by small-scale fishers who are often already at the margin of global supply chains. These impacts have obviously also been felt by the millions of people who are part of coastal communities who rely on tuna for their livelihoods and food. Ocean leaders from business, civil society, international organizations, science and technology now have an opportunity to conserve and sustainably use our ocean, seas and marine resources for sustainable development so that no one is left behind. During this session, we will be hearing from a wide range of speakers on tuna fisheries on 5 main topics, or pillars as we like to call them. You will hear about tuna fisheries in the context of biodiversity, plastic pollution, human rights, equity and harmful fishing subsidies. We invite you to be part of the solution and join the Reimagine Tuna initiative, helping us driving actions that are transformative, high impact and scalable so that we can envision a better world in harmony with nature. First off, we'll start with providing some additional context and show you a short film of some of the fisheries that we work with in Indonesia. Then we'll hear from Jeremy Crawford, IPLF Southeast Asia Director, under the pillar of biodiversity and Reimagine Tuna. We will not have a Q&A session. Instead, we'd like you to email us your questions, comments, and to join us. Thank you.
Saya memancing, penting buat saya. Antara memancing dia yang bikin hidup untuk saya.
Bagi saya, karena ini suatu pekerjaan bagi saya dan hobi, memang sudah dari turun-temurun.
The water area in Indonesia cover up about 4 times the land area. We even have a song about our ancestors are being fishermen. So we rely heavily in the fishery for our livelihoods. One-by-one fishing is catching one fish with using one hook, one at a time.
Ketika saya memancing, saya gunakan satu pancing untuk satu ikan.
Untuk mancing satu persatu ini banyak keuntungannya. Satu hal, dalam kualitas ikan itu dia baik dan dia itu ramah lingkungan.
Because we target the species that we want to catch. It has a really small bycatch.
Cara tangkap ini yang paling ramah lingkungan dan dapat memberikan dampak positif terhadap perekonomian masyarakat dan keberlanjutan dari alam bawah laut kita.
The fishermen catch the fish. Directly they put the fish into the ice to keep the fish in the fresh condition.
Within 1 or 2 days, they're going to come back to the port, either freeze it or directly go to the canning factory. When the fish arrive in the factory, first we're going to check for the freshness and the quality of the fish itself. Then you get cleaned, cooked, and then packed into the can.
Indonesia one-by-one tuna products are exported to market around the world.
The traceability is one of the most important part of our fisheries. When we catch it, we know where does the fish come from, which area of the oceans, and who caught it, when was it caught.
We take pride in delivering a product that exceeds our customer expectations.
About 7 million of our Indonesian people are working directly in the fisheries and in aquaculture.
Pekerjaan ini sangat membantu memberikan penghasilan yang stabil. Dengan bekerja di sini saya bisa membeli rumah dan bisa mencukupi kebutuhan keluarga.
Saya sangat senang bekerja di sini karena rasa kekeluargaannya tinggi.
Indonesia's pollen line and handline tuna fisheries have been on a journey since 2014 to achieve the Marine Stewardship Council certification.
The ultimate goal is to demonstrate the value that a well-managed fishery can bring to the coastal communities here in Indonesia. It's really the fishing community that depend upon this resource that are at the heart of our work. We want to make sure that they're recognised and rewarded for their environmental stewardship. So there's a lot of work happening on the ground to meet the standards. We're collecting a lot of data from the observers programme, from onboard cameras, from the vessel tracking systems, and we're also working hard with the Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries. Collaboration has been key throughout this project. Everyone coming together and working towards the same goal, to see these fisheries get the market recognition they deserve. Fisheries are low impact and so closely connected to the communities here in Indonesia. They contribute to a number of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So by supporting them, responsible businesses around the world can demonstrate their commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals.
For decades, we've been doing one-by-one fishing like this, and we want to ensure this will continue for our future generations.
If you buy the one-by-one fish, then you be a part of the sustainable fisheries in Indonesia.
You're actually supporting our fishery communities, especially our future generations.
I'd like to first thank the organizers for having us today and providing me the opportunity to speak about such an important topic. My name is Jeremy Crawford, and I'm the Southeast Asia Director for the International Pollen Line Foundation. Indonesia is a maritime nation and the largest tuna fishing country in the world. Annually, Indonesia catches more than 100,000 tons of tropical tuna. Up to 7 million people depend on fisheries in Indonesia, and as a matter of food security and livelihood, It's essential that these fisheries have low environmental impact. This ensures that marine resources and tuna stocks remain productive so that the communities that depend on the resource can remain viable now and for future generations to come. Fortunately, small-scale, one-by-one tuna fisheries, such as the ones that we saw in the video, has some of the lowest environmental impacts for tuna fishing around the world when it comes to bycatch, habitat degradation, and interactions with endangered, threatened, and protected species. IPNLF has been working in Indonesia since 2013, and with fishery stakeholders, we've collected scientific fishery data through onboard observers, port site enumerators, and even new technology such as time-lapse cameras and vessel tracking devices. This data has evidenced and demonstrated the low-impact nature of these fisheries, and together we use this information with local fishery managers to develop sustainable fishery policies and governance. Unfortunately, the voices of these fisheries have been drowned out in the marketplace and are replaced by cheap tuna from large offshore fleets that utilize destructive fishing methods such as person and longline, which have an immense negative impact on biodiversity and are riddled with human rights abuse. Many of these large-scale fisheries don't even come from the territories from which they operate in. And so when they've exploited all the natural resources in that area, it's the local communities that suffer the most, while these offshore fleets can sail to another fishing ground or go back to their home countries. For developing world countries like Indonesia, promoting and supporting responsible one-by-one tuna fisheries to local and international markets around the world are essential for the survival of these communities that rely on tuna resources and are essential for the planet with vibrant ecosystems and tuna stocks. These are fisheries that truly give back to the planet and to their societies. Next up, after me, will be Riaz Chauhari from the University of Montpellier in France, who will be giving another perspective from the Maldivian one-by-one tuna fishery. Thank you again for your time and allowing me to speak briefly about this topic that is near and dear to all of us.
Hello everyone. Fishing has been the main economic activity across the Maldives till tourism started in the 1970s. Unlike many other island nations, tuna has been the main source of protein for us. Our fishing practices have been always environment friendly. We have never used purse seines or gill nets to catch our tuna. For over a millennium, our fishers have caught tuna using hook and line, one by one. Such practices have ensured that we have a continuous supply of tuna throughout the year and over hundreds of years. The hook and line gear that we use ensures very low levels of unwanted bycatch and virtually no plastic pollution and ghost fishing. Pole and line and hand line are the main methods of fishing that we practice in the Maldives. And with these methods, each fish is caught one by one. In communities that live on small islands where there is little opportunity for income generating activities, fishing by hook and line ensures that the stocks are sustained, ecosystems are not harmed, and individuals are able to support their families. Today, there are several industrial fishing vessels operating in the Indian Ocean. These vessels target tuna, and most of these vessels are owned by companies from outside the region and fly the flags of distant water fishing nations. The fishing methods they use, such as purse seining and long lining, have serious impacts on the ecosystems and biodiversity of the region. In the northern Indian Ocean, large-scale and artisanal gill nets are also used. All these methods have serious impacts on endangered, threatened, and protected species, such as sharks, turtles, and marine mammals that associate with tuna schools. Nets lost at sea can easily become ghost gear, continuously killing indiscriminate number of marine organisms. It can also destroy habitats such as coral reefs and beaches. When purse seining was introduced in the region in the 1980s, the vessels started deploying drifting fish aggregating devices to aggregate tuna and also other marine life. thereby improving the efficiency of their fishing operations. These drifting feds are often deliberately abandoned and either sink or wash ashore on sensitive ecosystems, such as coral reefs, sandy beaches, and seagrass beds, where they continue to have negative environment impacts for many years to come. Our fishermen in the Maldives are encouraged to remove these abandoned, lost, and discarded drifting feds before they end up on our pristine coral reefs. Due to lack in transparency of the purse seine operations, only a fraction of drifting feds can, however, be recovered in this manner. Most stay in the ocean where they continue to ghost fish for many years. With an increase in number of foreign fleets operating in the Indian Ocean, the Maldivian tuna fishery is also impacted. It is not only affected by the pollution from the fishing gear, but also by over-exploitation of the resource. Tuna are migratory. They move into the Maldives' exclusive economic zone and move out of it, traveling to other parts of the Indian Ocean. As tuna migrate, they are caught by these industrial fishing fleets. The gear they use is more efficient and the vessels are much larger. Thus, they can harvest large quantities of tuna over a short period. This efficiency in catching tuna has been a major contributing factor to the overfish stock status of yellowfin tuna for the past 6 years. More than 90% of the yellowfin tuna caught around drifting feds are juveniles, which never get a chance to grow into a large fish that can feed coastal communities. Gillnet and purse seine fisheries are responsible for around 83% of the total catch of juvenile tuna. If destructive fishing methods like drifting fads and gill netting were phased out, it could lead to an immediate recovery of yellowfin tuna stocks. This will, however, not happen anytime soon, and unfortunately, this continues to directly impact on the livelihoods of Maldivian fishermen who practice low-impact one-by-one fishing methods. The Maldivian tuna fishers have always promoted and practiced environmentally friendly, sustainable fishing practices. Thus, we have continued to enjoy the benefits from such practices in our tuna fishery. We believe these practices will help to sustain our stocks for generations. Supporting such fisheries not only encourages sustainability of the stocks, but also help encourage and motivate those that practice such eco-friendly methods of fishing. Thank you. I will hand over now to Dr. Shiham Adam, IPNLF's Director for Science and Maldives.
Thank you, Riaz. Riaz noted the issues in highly commercial and industrial fisheries, where their fishing practices had serious impacts on biodiversity and the health of the ocean ecosystem. Overfishing issues with bycatch and discards, and the decimation of the endangered, threatened, and protected species, which are largely the result of malpractices of the industrial fisheries. The upshot is the loss of biodiversity and the loss of resilience in ocean productivity, which has a disproportionate impact on small-scale fisheries and the livelihoods of coastal communities. In the context of the climate change and the 2030 Agenda's universal principle of leaving no one behind, and in particular, SDG 14, where it talks of support for small-scale fisheries, meaning providing access for small-scale artisanal fishers to marine resources and markets, these actions contradict the good stewardship and responsible ways of fishing. Sadly, many of these industrial tuna fisheries still get preferential market access through third-party certification, and several retailers appear to turn a blind eye to these issues despite making claims about sustainable procurement. Under the Reimagine Tuna, Leaving No One Behind initiative, we are hoping to plant the seeds of change. challenging the status quo and calling for a more considered and more responsible way of harvesting the resources of the ocean. We are calling in this case for responsible governments, organizations, and markets to consider gear conversions of unselective gears, gill nets and long line, to more selective gears like the pollen line, hand line, and trolling. We are calling to control and effectively manage the use of drifting pads on the high seas, which has now become, for example, a major impediment to the rebuilding of the Indian Ocean yellowfin tuna stock. We are also calling for improvement in fishing methods that will minimize the likelihood of capturing and killing non-target species. For example, use of circle hooks for longline, purse seine fisheries not using fads, longline fishers using streamers to stop bird capture when setting long lines. We consider more resources should be spent where possible to live releasing endangered, threatened, and protected species and a fins naturally attached policy for retained sharks. In general, we are calling for the reduction of fishing pressure on the overexploited tuna and tuna-like species to allow stock recovery to sustainably harvestable levels and ensure long-term food and livelihood security. We like to see prioritizing of sustainable small-scale fisheries within exclusive economic zones and thereby limiting high seas fishing activities. We are convinced that such a model will help to protect and restore threatened and endangered marine species, habitats, and ecological functions. Now, Ibrahim Nadli, IPNL's Fisheries Research Officer, will now talk about the plastics impact of the tuna fisheries. Thank you.
Thank you, Shiham. I'm now going to provide some initial context on how fishing gears contribute to plastic pollution. Maldivian tuna fisheries have existed for more than 700 years. They have always been very careful to continue using responsible one-by-one fishing methods which their forefathers have passed to them. These fishing methods minimize ecosystem impacts while prioritizing harvest quality, maximizing local employment opportunities, and promoting high local community value from tuna fishing. Despite Maldives' long tradition of responsible fishing practices, ocean currents are having Maldivian ecosystems and communities suffer the consequences of fishing gears lost or abandoned by foreign fishing fleets that use more damaging fishing gears. Abandoned fishing gears called ghost gear cause a significant threat to marine species and sensitive marine ecosystems, especially when they continue killing animals long after they have been lost through a process called ghost fishing. Maldivian fishers have always played an active role in removing foreign ghost gear from the marine environment, while in 2019 the International Pollen Line Foundation partnered with the Olive Ridley Project and other local stakeholders to promote further collection and use of the foreign fishing gears they encounter. A pilot project was launched in the island of Gemanfushi, through which fishers have been retrieving these ghost gear and bringing them to a shore-based facility. The objective of this project is to support and promote local fishers' important efforts to preserve their local marine environment from foreign pollution threats, to collect as much ghost gear as possible, and to repurpose it to provide some new value to local communities. Some local repurposing examples include using parts of ghost gear to support creeper plants, building lovely swings or chairs, and using fishing buoys as spots for planting beautiful flower shrubs. Despite all these efforts, some fleets are losing or abandoning damaging fishing gears much faster than we can ever hope to recollect them. We really do need to tackle pollution at its source. To monitor local contributions to ghost gear, IPNLF's onboard fishery observers in the Maldives are collecting data on local fleets' fishing gear loss. Preliminary findings show that over the year, the whole Maldivian fleet only contribute less than 50 grams of monofilament fishing lines per ton of tuna landed. By collecting the same or more foreign fishing gear than they are losing themselves, these fishers are achieving plastic neutrality with regards to their gear. We hope other fleets will also reduce their contributions to dangerous marine pollution and pursue plastic neutrality as much as possible. My colleague Yaiza will now describe the different types of fishing aggregating devices used in tuna fishing before April explains their contributions to plastic pollution.
In the open ocean, many species, like tunas, associate with objects drifting on the ocean surface, such as logs or branches. And over time, fishers started to realize that they could increase their catch rates and operational efficiency by making some of these structures themselves to attract tunas. There are two basic designs of fats: those that are anchored and in place, the anchored fats, and those that are free to drift on the ocean surface, the drifting fats. Anchored fats have been used by coastal fishing communities for centuries to attract offshore species like tunas closer to shore and make them more accessible to small fishing vessels. Today, networks of anchored fats are benefiting artisanal fishers throughout the Caribbean, Indian Ocean, and Pacific Ocean. In contrast, drifting fats developed in the 1980s from the experimental efforts of mostly distant water fishing fleets to maximize their catch potential. Drifting fats are predominantly owned and utilized by large-scale industrial purseine vessels. And although the deployment of these fats often occurs on the high seas, they regularly drift through the economic zones of countries that have not granted permission for these devices to be there. It's super important to note that tuna populations only started to become overfished since the introduction of drifting fats. Juvenile big-eye tuna and juvenile yellowfin tuna are caught in association with drifting fats, and if these devices are not appropriately managed, it can become a major contributor to their overfished state. Other ecosystem impacts of these two types of fats are also totally different. A 2020 study showed that in the Western Central Pacific alone, between 45 and 65,000 drifting fats are estimated to be deployed each year by solely industrial purseine fleets. Only 13% of these drifting fats are recovered, meaning that 87% of them are either lost or deliberately abandoned. This means that between 39 and 56,000 drifting fats sink, are beached, or are abandoned annually. In contrast, and to provide a case study for anchored fats, the entire Maldivian pool and line tuna fleet, which consists of about 400 fishing boats, has 50 anchored fats available to them throughout its 90,000 square kilometers exclusive economic zone. These anchored fats are deployed and maintained by the national government and are designed to last for about 5 years. On average, 19 Maldivian anchored fats break free on an annual basis, which are replaced soon after they are reported lost. It's important to note that local fishers are incentivized to retrieve and return the lost fats, and as a result, about 9 of those detached anchored fats are recovered on an annual basis, making the annual loss rate around 10. So for a fleet of 400 Maldivian tuna vessels, the annual loss rate is on average 10 anchored fats for the whole fleet. In comparison, each purseine vessel in the Indian Ocean is allowed to use 300 drifting fats at any one time. This means that one purseine vessel can use 6 times more drifting fats than that there are anchored fats available to the entire Maldivian fleet. If the same drifting fat loss is applied to the Indian Ocean as in the Pacific, that would mean that each purseiner potentially loses 260 of those 300 drifting fats. However, because of a lack of transparency associated with drifting fat limits, that could mean that there are actually more fats deployed by each of the 35 to 40 purseiners that are operating in the Indian Ocean area. A conservative estimate would therefore be that around 9,000 drifting fats are lost by the Indian Ocean purseine fleet every year. To conclude this presentation, I would like to note that despite the relatively lower impact of the coastal and smaller selective tuna fisheries we work with, that it is very important to us to be deeply engaged in improving international and national policies that reduce the impact of both drifting and anchored fats.
Okay, thank you for that explanation, Yaza. I'm now going to pick up the story of fads in the context of marine pollution. And we will follow the impact of drifting fads and other discarded or lost fishing gear as they enter the coastal and island ecosystems within the Seychelles archipelago. So the Seychelles stretches across the southwest Indian Ocean and is sandwiched between two major current systems. These Seychelles Islands are inescapably accumulating the region's marine plastic pollution, and local communities or conservation organisations are then left to deal with it, despite already stretched resources. And the largest of the islands in this area is Aldabra Atoll. Aldabra is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, famous for its near pristine ecosystems with high densities of seabirds, sharks, turtles, and fish. But Aldabra is now also famous as having one of the highest densities of accumulated marine plastic litter worldwide, and 83% of which is fishing industry related. Drifting fads in particular are consistently arriving within the Aldabra Reserve, becoming entangled on the coastal coral, getting wedged in the mangroves. But the majority are washing up onto the beaches, clogging areas that are key turtle nesting habitat. And sometimes they're arriving with their ghost catch of sharks, turtles, and other marine life. Ghost catch results when abandoned, lost, or discarded fishing gear with netting and ropes continues to fish, and drifting fads are a key example of this ghost fishing. And this amount of plastic pollution arriving on Aldabra is simply unacceptable. So in 2019, we undertook a large-scale cleanup operation, and the expedition revealed the huge costs associated with such cleanups. The team collected and removed 25 tons of waste, which is just 5% of the 500 tons that we have estimated to have accumulated on Aldabra. Extensive surveys have revealed that 83%, that's around 426 tons, of the accumulated waste by weight was fishing industry related. The cleanup costs were calculated to be around $9,000 per ton of waste removed, and to clean up the remaining 500 tons would therefore cost around $5 million. Also, just to be clear, the costs do not end with removal, so the Seychelles then have to dispose of hundreds of tons of fishing gear, and without recycling infrastructure, currently the only option is landfill. What's all this got to do with fads? Well, the majority of waste clearly originated from industrial fisheries, and the main items we can identify are drifting fads used by the purse seine industry. These fads often have identification codes linking them to the ship that deployed them. And from cleanup efforts across the Seychelles, we've been able to link these fads back to the industrial purse seine tuna vessels registered to fish in the Seychelles EEZ. But these vessels clearly do not intend to recollect them. And these results are alarming, firstly because they show undisputable proof that pollution generated by the regional industrial fisheries is polluting these island ecosystems. And secondly, if the fishing industry is the major contributor to marine pollution litter in the region, then it's almost certainly having indirect negative impacts on the fish communities that it needs to sustain. I want to draw attention to these less directly observable and recordable impacts of fads. In this picture, the fad is entangled on the coastal cast of Aldabra, and whether trapped on the coastline or circulating offshore, the synthetic materials are constantly breaking down into smaller and smaller pieces and entering the marine ecosystem. There's growing evidence now of the physiological impacts of plastic to coral, to fish, and to humans as well, impacting the survival, development, and fertility. So the costs of drifting fads and other lost or discarded fishing gear are clear. Firstly, the huge financial costs of cleaning fisheries litter from the environment. Secondly, the huge environmental costs to ecosystems and species. And then the huge costs to human health that could have far-reaching and unknown consequences. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll now pass on to Zachary Edwards from International Pole and Line Foundation to discuss human rights in fisheries.
Thank you, April, for the introduction. My name is Zach Edwards, and I work as the Socio-Economic Manager for IPNLF. As mentioned, this session will focus on the human rights pillar of Reimagine Tuna. And unfortunately, human rights abuses continue unabated in many tuna fisheries, despite this issue having been raised within the industry for many years. Historically, discussions surrounding environmental sustainability have largely overshadowed concerns about human rights abuses. This has meant that some tuna products promoted as the best choice in terms of environmental sustainability have been able to secure market access without due attention being placed on potential human rights issues that may be occurring. Human rights issues are now emerging as a key area of concern in the seafood sector, taking the form of modern-day slavery, human trafficking, physical abuse, and in some cases, the murder of crew or scientific observers on fishing vessels. Where the sustainable seafood movement was primarily focused on environmental challenges facing the sector, social issues such as identifying human risks and actuating remediation activities are now being pushed to the forefront of the attention of the industry. Distant water fishing fleets have since been identified as the area of the industry eliciting the highest levels of contextual risk for such issues, as they are able to avoid relevant authorities and general accountability by operating beyond national waters for extensive periods of time without returning to port. However, despite this, there are many examples within our industry where high-risk fisheries without effective due diligence measures in place continue to supply tuna to Western markets. In response, Reimagine Tuna will be calling on retailers, the food service industry, and their suppliers to take greater responsibility to ensure that their tuna products are free from human rights abuses and to avoid sourcing from highest-risk fisheries altogether. As an organisation, IPNLF work on a number of fronts to ensure sufficient human rights due diligence is taking place within tuna supply chains. In my own role, I provide technical support to a number of human and labour rights focused groups to help ensure that worst performing fleets are held to greater accountability. More broadly, as a team, we assist in the review and formulation of various industry standards, guidelines, and best practice recommendations aimed at benchmarking what constitutes good performance in relation to human rights issues in the seafood industry. Because IPNLF works exclusively with small-scale fisheries, we also engage with various groups to ensure that proposed solutions to human rights issues adequately account for both the financial and contextual constraints faced by small-scale fisheries to participate and evidence their good performance. This often remains an oversight of proposed solutions, and in response, IPNLF have developed a number of tools aimed at levelling the playing field for the small-scale fisheries we work with. For example, our new Fisheries Improvement Toolbox provides a framework for working collaboratively with our commercial members and fisheries on social issues, including human rights due diligence. And through our new sourcing transparency platform, we provided a tool that helps improve the transparency of seafood products and communicate the human rights due diligence activities implemented within our commercial members' supply chains. So to summarize, although the industry is increasingly placing attention on human rights issues, the sector has a long way to go before human rights abuses are adequately identified and addressed throughout tuna supply chains. Moving forward, it's important that the procurement choices of companies become more aligned with both the contextual risk posed by fisheries and the due diligence activities occurring within tuna supply chains. On that note, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Claire Clifton from Worldwise Foods, who will be sharing her insights on the role of the marketplace in addressing such issues.
Thank you, Zach, for your introduction. So I work for Worldwise Foods, and we were started as a business over a decade ago by our CEO, John Burton, who's the former chairman of the IPNLF. And John is really passionate about one-by-one fishing methods and small-scale fisheries because of their positive environmental impacts and the social benefits for fishing communities. Our product range now goes way beyond fish, but we see the way that we source tuna as part of our contribution to a bigger picture in the industry, particularly in UN Sustainable Development Goal 14, which encourages us to ensure that developing nation fisheries can access international markets, making the most of their ocean resources to drive their own development. I guess you could call us a business that focuses on both profit and purpose. So at Worldwise Food, my role is to look after our work on ethical trade, so human rights, and sustainable sourcing. So that's the way we source our raw materials. And as a company following the UN principles for business and human rights, this starts in my role with a risk assessment of our supply chains and a due diligence process, which encourages us to focus on identifying highest risk issues and those issues that we have the most leverage to address. The biggest challenge is about access to information at vessel level. There's so much information that is just anecdotal and is not necessarily evidence. And it's quite hard to gather meaningful data from fishers. For example, on sensitive topics such as responsible recruitment, we already see at factory level that audits don't really do this effectively. Workers never share in interviews with auditors critical issues. And the only way to really get information from fishers is from them engaging with kind of local organisations or people that they already trust. Otherwise, you get a false perspective of what the risks are. I think the other challenges for me is that we source from different countries, and every country, and in some cases regions within countries, they manage fishers' rights differently, and they have different mechanisms to check that their employment rights are being met. So you need lots of local knowledge to understand how to build up those systems rather than just trying to implement your own system of checks and balances on top, which can have unintended consequences. The final challenge that I would flag is the importance that we have culturally appropriate responses to the human rights risks that we see in our supply chains and small-scale fisheries, and in how we try to mitigate and manage those risks. So I think it's the FAO guidelines on good practice in fisheries points out that we should respect different cultures, including recognising and respecting traditional forms of organisation. So we really have to be careful that we don't impose things like formal contracts that work for us, make us feel safe in our employment and clear on our rights in our context, but it really may not achieve that in a small-scale fishery context. And we have to be adaptable and manage risks in a way that actually manage risk in that local context. From an individual company perspective, we need to follow the due diligence principles that are set out in the UN guiding principles for businesses. But how you implement this as a company depends hugely on the scale of your business, the relationship and the leverage that you have in your supply chain. So we're fortunate we have close working relationships with our suppliers. We aim to have long-term relationships with our suppliers, and we don't have hundreds of fisheries that we source from. So this enables us to work with individual fisheries, to have the leverage to do that, and to assess human rights risks and find ways to address them in collaboration with our supply chain partners. But we also acknowledge it's really challenging and everybody's kind of at early stages. But to us, we need to rise to that challenge. It's something that all businesses need to tackle, regardless of their size and the nature of their supply chains. For a larger company, obviously, it's challenging. There needs to still be that prioritisation process, but they still need to focus on the highest risk fisheries in their supply chains and find ways to tackle those issues. I think talking more about an industry perspective rather than individual business, collaboration is really key. So collaboration between businesses will help the industry to move forward together at a faster pace, trying to tackle human rights risks on vessels. And also working together, it amplifies our influence and our voice, and enables us to innovate faster if we're willing to be open with each other and share learnings on how we're trying to address human rights risks and what works and why. I would also hope that building shared understanding as an industry will begin to inform commercial decisions, so that the commercial decisions that our customers make really reflect the actions of companies who are proactively managing human rights risks versus those that are not. And I think it's important to say this is not about rewarding businesses for what they should be doing anyway in terms of managing human rights risks, but it's about creating a level playing field where those that are not taking the management of human rights risks seriously are not rewarded commercially whilst they take this position. And I think this point about influencing commercial decisions applies all the way along the supply chain. It should apply to where we source from, it should apply to where our customers source from and beyond. And thank you for enabling me to participate in this event. And I just want to introduce our next speaker, Talika Bansal of the Danish Institute of Human Rights.
Thank you, Claire, for the introduction. I'm Talika Bansal and work as a senior advisor on business and human rights at the Danish Institute for Human Rights. And as this institution, we have a mandate to work internationally with states, private sector, and other actors. As part of a 5-year project that has been funded by SIDA, the Swedish Development Corporation, we are implementing a project called Sustainable Oceans, a human rights-based approach to fisheries and aquaculture. And as part of this project, we have been conducting a number of studies on the human rights impacts of the fisheries and aquaculture sectors, which includes raising awareness of what human rights are for this sector and what human rights due diligence means for companies in the fishery sectors. Amongst others, we have conducted different impact assessments of sectors in the fisheries and aquaculture sector. For example, the salmon farming industry in Chile and the capture fishery sector in Bangladesh. We're also developing a number of tools and knowledge products linking fisheries and human rights, as we see that these two topics have not really closely been interlinked with each other. The main challenge to promote and protect human rights in the fishery sector more generally is the fact that the impacts take place on sea. Many human rights institutions do not have the capacity nor the knowledge to engage in these sectors. So it's not easy, for example, to conduct a human rights impact assessment or other steps of the human rights due diligence cycle when the activities are offshore, so they're not on land. So it's harder to access the actual vessels and workers and other rights holders that could be impacted. For example, assessing whether small-scale fishers' access rights to fisheries resources are respected requires going out to the sea to inspect, which is not easy to uncover through a simple audit or an inspection. And practicing human rights due diligence requires capacity. It also requires financial and human resources, knowledge, and time, and which will likely be more limited and challenging for small-scale fishers, including commercial small-scale fishers, than, for example, industrial fishing fleets who have much more financial and human resources to do so. There are many laws and conventions, as well as non-binding instruments that apply to those operating on the sea, so companies, vessels, but also small-scale fishers. Certain legal instruments apply to large-scale vessels, but not to small-scale vessels. So, for example, think of the ILO Working Fishing Convention 188, meaning that the rights of workers on small vessels are not included in this convention. And while such laws apply to the industrial fishing sector, enforcement of these laws is challenging due to the lack of capacity and resources by the state to carry out inspections. What is needed is that states ensure that small-scale fishers and workers' rights are respected, and that those implementing their rights, often being large industrial fleets, are held accountable in accordance with the SSF guidelines and the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. One of the main takeaways that I would like to share is that when speaking about human rights due diligence in the fisheries sector, I think it's really important to make the distinction between large-scale and small-scale fisheries, as they cannot be seen as just one fishing sector. Firstly, there is a need for more legal enforcement for industrial fishing. And secondly, there is a need for tailored mechanisms to make human rights due diligence more possible and accessible for small-scale fishers, given their specific context that they operate in. We'll now be going to the next main pillar of this session, which is to discuss equity. I'd like to hand over to Roy Bealey, Fisheries Director, IPNLF. Thank you.
Thank you, Talika. We will now focus on the equity pillar of Reimagine Tuna, leaving no one behind, and discuss how equitable modern fisheries management and seafood trade systems are. As more small-scale fishers travel further offshore to harvest large and valuable fish like tunas, many are now experiencing the consequences of industrial-scale overfishing. Unfortunately, international fisheries management mechanisms and globalized seafood trade systems are not genuinely supporting the Leave No One Behind vision of Agenda 2030 and the Sustainable Development Goals. The largest fleets, which are typically owned by foreign developed nations and that benefit the most from harmful subsidies, often also use the most damaging fishing gears while prioritizing profit maximization. These fleets and the countries connected to them are usually also the ones dominating modern-day fisheries management and trade systems. Large fleets can also more cost-effectively achieve certifications that are demanded as an entry point for access to premium markets, while in many cases further reducing their operating costs by abusing captive labour, especially when they're operating on the relatively lawless high seas. All these factors tend to further marginalise small-scale fisheries in developing nations, which represent critical local lifelines for millions of people. The COVID pandemic has seen more of the coastal poor turn to fishing as a lifeline, but many are being bitterly disappointed to realise their resources have already been overfished. The rights and needs of small-scale fishers cannot become collateral damage to big industries' pursuit of profit at all costs. Under the equity pillar of Reimagine Tuna, we will explore this theme further and see what needs to happen to address this critical issue in the ocean economy. Firstly, we'll be looking at a collaborative short film produced by IPNLF, AP2HI, MDPI, and Blue Ventures, highlighting why small-scale fisheries should be prioritized in global supply chains, with seafood businesses supporting and nurturing these fisheries in order to enhance contributions to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. After that, we'll hear from Jess, the Head of Investigations at the Blue Marine Foundation.
Globally, it's estimated capture fisheries support 120 million livelihoods, and 90% of those working in this sector come from small-scale fisheries. These fisheries play the biggest role in maintaining food security and providing livelihoods, welfare, and social protection safety nets in some of the most impoverished communities around the world. The majority of the catches from small-scale fisheries are consumed locally. However, they also play an increasingly important role in commercial capture fisheries supply chains. Despite their importance and contributions to community well-being, small-scale fisheries continue to be marginalized and are outcompeted by the interest and supply chains dominance of the large-scale industrial sector. However, there are opportunities for these fisheries to grow and expand. But to do so, they need support from responsible businesses. With the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals providing a platform to create a sustainable future for all, seafood businesses have an opportunity to push this development agenda forward. Through engaging with and supporting the world's small-scale sector, these fisheries have a chance to operate in the global seafood markets, increasing the equitability of internationally traded seafood as well as delivering benefits to coastal, resource-dependent communities.
Many thanks, Roy. I'm Jess Rattle, Head of Investigations at Blue Marine Foundation, and I'm going to speak briefly around issues pertaining to equity and fishing, looking mainly at fishing by distant water fleets in international waters. As we all know, the areas of ocean beyond national jurisdiction and beyond the control of any one nation state are the high seas. These massive expanses of open ocean have been called the ultimate global commons, and for good reason. A patchwork of regional fisheries management organizations, or RFMOs, exists to manage these areas and the highly migratory fish stocks like tuna that move through them. However, RFMOs carry out this duty with varying degrees of success. Just this week, the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission, the RFMO in charge of managing the stocks that move between the waters of Indian Ocean coastal states and the high seas, will be meeting to see if they can put a stop to the overfishing of yellowfin tuna that has been taking place unchecked since 2015. I say unchecked, but that's not strictly true. In 2016, a stock rebuilding plan was put in place for yellowfin tuna, with varying catch reductions by country and gear type. However, despite this, catches of yellowfin tuna in the Indian Ocean have actually increased every year since 2017, with even greater cuts now needing to be put in place at this week's meeting. The situation is so dire that in April of last year, a group of 13 leading fisheries scientists sounded the alarm, warning that the Indian Ocean yellowfin tuna stock could collapse by 2026 if nothing is done to reduce fishing pressure. However, this warning wasn't issued in an academic article or in an IOTC information paper. It was stated in detail in a letter specifically to the European Commissioner Virginijus Sinkevicius. Now that might seem a bit strange at first, but for anyone who is familiar with the yellowfin tuna crisis unfolding in the Indian Ocean, the reason that it was addressed to the Commissioner is probably quite clear. The EU's distant water fleet catches more tropical tuna in the Indian Ocean than any other IOTC member. Even when looking at overfished yellowfin tuna in isolation, they are still by far the biggest player. Not only does the EU purse seine fleet catch more yellowfin than anyone else, but because of its reliance on fish aggregating devices, or FADs, upwards of 90% of its yellowfin tuna catch is made up of juvenile fish. One might hope that the EU, as a global superpower, would try to play a leading role in the conservation of the stock, given the leading role that it has played in its destruction. One might even expect there to be pushback from coastal states through whose waters these fish migrate and whose communities depend on fishing for their very survival. Yet, at the last session of the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission in March, we saw nations like the Maldives and Kenya show admirable leadership by putting forward bold and ambitious proposals to cut catches and improve FAD management. In stark contrast, the EU chose to use its negotiating prowess to undermine and derail efforts by these developing coastal states by refusing to negotiate down from its inequitable and unsustainable position that ignored both the precautionary principle and the needs of coastal communities. The behavior of the EU in the Indian Ocean Forum has earned them some well-founded accusations, like that of neo-colonialism, hypocrisy, and greed. However, what I find most shocking of all is the EU's seeming indifference to the plight of Indian Ocean coastal states should the stock collapse. If we discover that yellowfin tuna has been fished to the point of no return and that all fishing will have to cease, the distant water fleets will simply move their efforts to a different ocean and will continue to fish there. However, the consequences for developing coastal nations and small island developing states are unthinkable. They do not have the luxury to pick up and go elsewhere. And for that reason, it shouldn't come as a surprise to us that they are the ones acting with urgency and with the long term in mind, while developed distant water fishing nations try to maintain the status quo for as long as possible, no matter the cost. While the Indian Ocean is a stark example, it's by no means the only area in which industrial distant water fleets play a leading role in the destruction of fish stocks that coastal states depend on for food security and economic survival. A 2018 study by Enrique Sala et al. Found that only 6 countries, China, Taiwan, Japan, Indonesia, Spain, and South Korea, account for 77% of the global high seas fishing fleet. The study also showed that fishing at the current scale is enabled by large government subsidies, without which as much as 54% of the present high seas fishing grounds would be unprofitable at current fishing rates. This means that without subsidies, more than half of the present high seas fishing grounds would be unprofitable. Another 2018 study, this one by David Tickler et al., found that much of the high seas, as well as the waters of developing countries in fisheries-rich areas like West Africa, are open to abuse of both fisheries regulations and international labor standards, allowing illegal fishing and potentially labor abuses to flourish. Given these findings, It's hardly surprising that closing the high seas to fishing is appearing increasingly often as a potential solution, albeit quite a complex one. In a report produced for Blue by Dr. Rashid Sumaila last year, Dr. Sumaila stated that an analysis of fisheries data has indicated that catches in coastal waters could surpass current global levels if the high seas were closed to fishing. These findings, he said, have led to a call to turn the high seas into a fish bank for the world, where fish can grow without the threat of being caught, and then seed the fished areas within national waters. While not without its challenges, greater protection of the high seas, combined with the development of low-impact fisheries in coastal areas, could produce a win-win, and could see the creation of more equitable and sustainable fisheries that benefit fish stocks, coastal communities, and the marine environment. Thank you so much. I would now like to hand over to Yinji Lee of Tokai University in Japan, who will talk more about small-scale fisheries in Northern Asia. Thank you.
皆さんこんにちは. Hello everyone. My name is Yinji Lee. I'm an associate professor at Tokai University, Japan. My research area focuses on small-scale fisheries in Japan and other Northeast Asian regions. Like in many other places around the world, the meaning of small-scale fisheries in Japan is significant. More than 80% of fishers are engaged in small-scale fisheries, and 90% of them are family-run, including small-scale one-by-one and handline tuna, skipjack fisheries. The biggest concern that I see about Japanese small-scale fisheries, including tuna fisheries, is distorted equality. That is, the lack of difference principle of gender roles, which is also recognizable in the voluntary small-scale fisheries guidelines, and the lack of equity and justice due to that. One example is distorted equality between small-scale fisheries and industrial fisheries on the total allowable catch management of the tuna. It's been seen that same allocation between different scale fisheries and also the deduction of excess have exceeded in the same form, with less consideration on small-scale fisheries. This can be heard from the claims of small-scale fishing fishers in Rumoi area of Hokkaido, who even filed a trial, and the claims from Iki Fishers Organization in Nagasaki Prefecture, which small-scale fishing fishers launched for fear of industrial fishery, and many other claims from many other fishers, for instance in the government advisory committee meetings. Such concerns are increasing with the new Japanese fisheries policy promoting total allowable catch system. This new policy, legislated in 2018, emphasizes on the resource management by, for instance, total allowable catch system and fisheries efficiency, achieving for a growth industrial, while the original policy emphasized on fisheries democratization. Many other concerns about this new policy have been pointed out by the Japanese Small-Scale Fisheries Research Network, Too Big to Ignore Japan. The second is distorted equality between professional fishery and recreational fishery. With the citizens' increasing claims against fisheries for equal use of the seas and coastal areas, there's not much systematic management to the recreational fishery in Japan. As a result, there are problems that the recreational fishery catches the fish that small-scale fishing fishers are putting up with the fishing for resource management. This problem is seen not only in tuna, but in many other fisheries species. To sum up, we need the deference principle and equity in our governance system in Japan for the sustainability of small-scale fisheries. Thank you. I'd like to hereby hand it over to Craig Turley, IPNLF Fisheries Improvement Manager, to go into harmful subsidies.
Thank you, Yinji. My name is Craig Turley and I'm the Fisheries Improvement Manager here at the International Pole and Line Foundation. And today I'm going to introduce the fifth pillar of Reimagine Tuna, and that is harmful fisheries subsidies. Harmful fisheries subsidies can be included as the capacity enhancing subsidies. So these are subsidies that contribute to things such as fuel, vessel construction, engine or fishing gear. And they generally enhance the ability of a vessel to go further offshore, stay at sea longer, and generally catch more fish than they could otherwise afford to. And this has been widely acknowledged as one of the key drivers of overfishing. Studies have shown that in 2018, there were roughly $35.4 billion from governments going to these harmful fisheries subsidies. And roughly 81% of that goes to the industrial fishing subsector, and 19% goes to the small-scale fleets. So clearly there's need for reform across the board, both for the industrial and for the small-scale sector. And these subsidies need to be reformed, instead going towards management and environmental protection. Now, because 81% of these harmful subsidies goes towards the industrial fishing subsector, that further enhances their ability to undermine the small-scale fishing subsector or the artisanal fishing subsector, and further drive the inequity that we've already heard about. And they do this in several ways. Firstly, the overcapacity and the ability of these industrial fisheries to overfish high seas and coastal waters means that there's less resources for small-scale fishers to catch. Secondly, the industrial fisheries can catch way more fish and then introduce us to the market, flooding the market with vast quantities of highly subsidized seafood. And this undermines the value of seafood and undermines the ability of coastal states to generate livelihoods from that catch. And finally, those industrialized fleets, they can afford to get private certification labels, which then legitimizes their produce and allows it to go to retailers and supermarkets. And many of you might be surprised to know that the Marine Stewardship Council Eco Label, or the MSC label, actually their current standard has no mention of harmful subsidies, and fisheries are able to be fully certified whilst still being in receipt of harmful subsidies. And that's something that certainly needs to change. So anyway, continuing on, we are going to hear from the man, the legend himself, Sir David Attenborough. We didn't take this video. It's a collaboration between WWF, Our Planet, Friends of Ocean Action, and the World Economic Forum, and is a message to the World Trade Organization. And after Sir David, we will go over to Frederic Lemanac from Paris-based NGO Bloom.
Imagine a healthy ocean, its abundance and vitality restored. And not just any ocean, your ocean. Every corner of every ocean around the world, vibrant, abundant, and productive. Healthy seabeds, fish stocks recovered, monitored wisely, fished sustainably, and feeding many more people than they do now. The good news is that it is possible, but we are standing in our own way. We are paying huge sums of money, public money, to keep damaging and destructive fishing activities afloat. Government subsidies are keeping fishing boats fishing, even when there are too few fish left for fishing to be profitable. These subsidies create tensions between competing fishermen and nations. And they also fund the ongoing destruction of the natural world on which we all depend. But all is not lost. We can turn this around right now. Your governments have been tasked with negotiating new global rules on fisheries subsidies by the end of this year to set us all on a more sustainable course. The World Trade Organization has previously negotiated global rules for government subsidies to industry and farming. Now it's time to put an end to subsidies that harm our oceans too. Around the globe, small-scale projects are already paving a way forward, showing how investment in local coastal communities can lead to remarkable recoveries under the waves. A global deal to end harmful fishery subsidies is the next vital step in the restoration of our oceans to their former abundance and diversity. Reaching the right deal might not be easy, but a sustainable future for the oceans and ourselves is within reach. We must seize this opportunity and act now to ensure a healthier future for each and every one of us forever.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. I'm Frédéric Lemanac from the NGO Bloom, which is based in Paris. So we are mostly known in Europe for our fights against destructive fishing. And for example, we've obtained a ban on deep sea bottom trawling in Europe in 2016. And in 2019, we've obtained a ban on electric fishing, which was another destructive method. So we do work a lot at Bloom on fisheries subsidies, especially the harmful ones, because we believe that harmful subsidies is the main reason why we still have overfishing and habitat destruction in the world. We think that if we removed these subsidies, we wouldn't have any issues anymore, basically. So it's the main problem. We solve the problem. We don't have destruction of marine ecosystems anymore. So harmful subsidies create inequity for small-scale fisheries because all the science in the world shows two things. The first one is that large-scale industrial fisheries get most of the subsidies. It's about 80% worldwide. And most of these subsidies are harmful. So for example, it's the case for fuel subsidies or construction subsidies or modernization subsidies. All these subsidies basically decrease the cost of fishing. So for the same cost, you increase the capacity that you put at sea to catch the fish. So it's a massive issue worldwide. And because the large-scale industrial destructive fisheries get most of the subsidies, then you have a distortion that is created for small-scale fisheries. So basically you have, if you take the example of West Africa or the Western Indian Ocean, you have very large, efficient vessels up to 100, 120 meter long sometimes that catch massive amounts of fish. And just near them, you have small-scale fishers that do have to compete with them. So not only you have the destruction of marine ecosystems and massive amounts of fish that are caught by these foreign vessels, you also have the small-scale fishers that have to engage in destructive practices so that they can maintain their income. So the fact that we, as Europe or Asia, subsidize large-scale industrial destructive fisheries is a big issue for small-scale fishers because it creates an incentive for them to behave in a wrong way as well. So one thing that we can say about the Western Indian Ocean, which is one of the largest tuna fishing grounds in the world, just after the Pacific Ocean, is that in a similar way that we can see in Europe or North America or in South America, we have the large-scale fisheries from Asia or Europe that get the subsidies. And for example, when we look at the tuna sector, we have large fleets from Asia, like long-liners fleets, and we have large-scale European purseинers that were built thanks to public subsidies, that operate thanks to public subsidies, for example, through a network of fishing access agreements that European citizens pay for. So basically, we pay for everything. We pay for the vessel, we pay for the fuel, we pay for the access. We also probably pay for the market. And if we removed all these subsidies, these operations would go bankrupt, basically. But at the same time, we have small-scale fishers, for example, in Madagascar or in Comoros or in the Seychelles or in Kenya, that probably would like to go at sea, to catch the fish, to catch the tuna, but they can't, because they have massive vessels in front of them that catch too much fish, and so you have a distortion in the ability for these fishers to catch the tuna. So the key point is that if we removed the subsidies for fuel, for fishing access agreements, for construction or modernization of the vessels, these foreign fleets would probably go bankrupt. Yes, so fishing access agreement is a big issue that nobody really talks about. So it's essentially a contract that allows vessels from China or Japan or the European Union to go fishing in the waters of Madagascar or Senegal or the Seychelles. And most of these agreements are publicly funded, which means that, for example, European taxpayers will pay for the access so that European large-scale vessels can go fishing in Madagascar. And this is not something that is marginal, because, for example, in Europe, the total cost of these agreements for the European taxpayers every year nears almost 100 million euros. So it's actually a big part of the economic model of the tuna purseинers fleet from Europe, but it's also a big part of the economic model for the Asian fleets or other fleets in the world. So when we look at the commitments and objectives that we have in Europe as part of the Common Fisheries Policy or worldwide with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, for example, the subsidization of large-scale industrial fleets is the opposite of what we should do. So when we look at the big companies, they all have the same blue economy, wording, and everything is fine, and they create jobs and equity and they protect the environment. But now we know that thanks to 30 or 40 years of research on subsidies, we know that it's not true. So as long as we'll maintain these subsidies for construction, for fuel, for modernization, for access, we'll have a big issue of sustainability. And it's not only sustainability, it's also political stability, it's economic livelihoods, it's social stability. And so we need to fix that. We need to remove harmful subsidies so that coastal communities can emerge and take care for themselves. So as long as we'll have these subsidies, we won't have sustainability. It doesn't mean that once we remove these subsidies, we'll have sustainability, because there are other challenges. But for us, it really is the main starting point. We need to get rid of these subsidies. Next up is Maggie Rodriguez Esquivel from AIDA, and she will be talking about the redirect of subsidies to management and conservation in Latin America.
Thanks, Frederick. Hello, everyone. My name is Maggie Rodriguez, and I am a Costa Rican attorney in the Marine Biodiversity and Coastal Protection Program in AIDA. AIDA is a regional organization that uses the law and science to promote the right for a healthy environment in Latin America. One of the main focuses of the marine program right now is to revamp fisheries subsidies and the way they are granted in the region. We are working towards redirecting harmful subsidies that promote enhanced capacity and overfishing towards those beneficial subsidies that promote sustainable use of fish stocks and improved livelihoods of fisher folk. We understand that eliminating fishery subsidies as a whole would create more harm than good. By doing so, we would only hurt those who depend on the ocean and fisheries for sustenance. We also know that this change must take place at all levels, starting from industrial scale fisheries up to small-scale fisheries and at an international, regional, and national level of policy. This is also a human rights issue. By promoting sustainable fisheries, we also promote adequate labor conditions and improved and better livelihoods. Latin America is home of some of the most important biodiversity hotspots in the region, including the Eastern Tropical Pacific Marine Corridor and the Costa Rican Thermal Dome. However, it is reported that about 50 to 70% of stocks are overexploited. This is due because of overcapacity and overfishing, and also because of illegal fishing, the latter being exacerbated by distant water fleets that are only possible because of subsidies. Right now, at the World Trade Organization, member countries are negotiating an agreement that could possibly end harmful subsidies. Countries must unite towards a very ambitious agreement that could benefit not only the ocean and those who depend on it, but all of us. Countries must recognize that also small-scale fisheries can cause enhanced capacity and overfishing, especially those that are being subsidized and not adequately managed. It is urgent that we rethink of the way subsidies are granted and start thinking them as tools to promote sustainable use of fish stocks and improved livelihoods. Helping fisher folk, one of the most vulnerable people in the Latin American region and also the world. The ocean needs us, and the time to act is now. Thank you everyone for having me, and now back to Craig from the International Pole and Line Foundation.
Thank you, Maggie, and thank you, Frederick. So it's clear harmful subsidies need reform. So what can we do in order to reimagine tuna? Firstly, NGOs and national governments can work together in order to reform subsidies programs and redirect funds towards mechanisms that support small-scale fishers, support monitoring, control and surveillance, and environmental protection. Secondly, NGOs can support the call to end harmful subsidies and visit stopfundingoverfishing.com. Thirdly, retailers and markets have a big part to play in this. They can avoid generic sourcing policies that rely on private eco-labels and risk sourcing from fisheries that are in receipt of harmful fishery subsidies, and instead do their due diligence, seek to support small-scale fisheries that use environmentally and socially responsible fishing techniques and have a chance of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. Fourth, private eco-labels and certification standards such as the Marine Stewardship Council MSC eco-label should have zero tolerance to harmful subsidies and should suspend fisheries that they suspect may be in receipt of harmful subsidies and avoid new fisheries from entering the certification process. Fifth and finally, consumers. Consumers need to choose your tuna. Choose tuna from environmentally and socially responsible sources that support small-scale fisheries. And these can include pole and line, rod and reel, and handline fisheries. So thanks for listening, and to wrap up this session, I'm going to hand it over to the Managing Director of the International Pole and Line Foundation, Martin Purvis, who is going to let us know how we can reimagine tuna. Thank you.
Thanks, Craig. I'm Martin Purvis, and I'm the Managing Director of the International Pole and Line Foundation. I'll be wrapping up our Reimagine Tuna session today. Firstly, I would like to thank all of our speakers for their excellent contributions and for highlighting the important issues that small-scale fisheries are facing on a daily basis. A recurring theme from today's talks has been the inequity that is a systemic feature of the current ocean economy. This is particularly relevant when we consider the need to ensure equal access to fishing opportunities and markets for small-scale fisheries. Although we looked at this today from the perspective of tuna fisheries, it is obvious that these issues are also very relevant for other small-scale fisheries. Access to ocean resources and sectors is rarely equitably distributed. Many of the benefits of these resources are accumulated by a few, while most of the negative impacts that accompany the development and exploitation of these resources are borne by the most vulnerable. Inequity is a systemic feature of the current ocean economy. It is embedded in existing political and economic systems, the result of historical legacies and prevailing norms. This inequity has brought global environmental challenges and negative effects on human well-being. A sustainable ocean economy should protect human rights, improve human well-being, stimulate inclusion and gender equity, and prioritize recognition, diversity, and equal access to resources to provide fair opportunities consistent with sustainable development. The ocean covers over 70% of our planet and serves as the main source of protein for more than 1 billion people around the world. It also produces oxygen, stores carbon and heat, and plays an important role in our general well-being. The biosphere upon which humanity depends is being altered to an unparalleled degree across all spatial scales. Biodiversity, the diversity within species, between species, of ecosystems, is declining faster than at any time in human history. 1 million species of plants and animals are facing extinction, many within decades, unless action is taken to tackle the drivers of biodiversity loss. If we don't take action, the rate of species extinction will accelerate even further. We rely on biodiversity for our survival, but our activities are the primary cause of huge declines. In the ocean, fishing is the activity that drives the greatest loss of biodiversity. Many industrial tuna fisheries use some of the most destructive fishing gears in terms of their impacts on endangered, threatened, and protected species, such as sharks, turtles, seabirds, and marine mammals. They also have huge impacts on the broader ecosystem. Ghost fishing gear, often resulting from industrial fishing activities, has been shown to be the deadliest form of marine plastic, as it is non-selective. It catches wildlife, entangling marine mammals, seabirds, sea turtles, and sharks, subjecting them to slow and painful deaths through exhaustion and suffocation. Ghost fishing gear, mostly made up of plastics, also damage critical marine habitats such as coral reefs and sandy beaches. Industrial tuna fisheries are some of the worst polluters in terms of the ocean plastics they leave behind. Drifting fads, for instance, used by the purse seine fishing industry are mostly abandoned, lost, or discarded by the thousands instead of being retrieved after deployment. These drifting fads can have up to 100 meters of netting and other plastic materials that continue to degrade sensitive coastal and deepwater ecosystems when they beach or sink. A recent study, for instance, in the Pacific showed that less than 10% of these drifting fads are retrieved by the large purse seiners that set them. That means that every year, more than 7,000 drifting fads in the Western and Central Pacific Ocean alone continue to pollute and degrade marine ecosystems. Industrial longline vessels catching tuna have huge impacts on sharks, turtles, and seabirds, and are also often associated with serious human rights abuses. These vessels lose thousands of kilometers of monofilament longline gear every year. These longlines drift to the seafloor, where it can degrade habitat through direct impacts such as smothering of organisms on the benthos, and also via entanglement of bottom-dwelling species, such as coral and sponge communities. It is also common practice on some longline vessels to discard the so-called bird nests of line over the side when their main line is pulled off the drum as the vessel proceeds at high speed and the line becomes snagged. So not only are these industrial tuna fisheries responsible for huge impacts on biodiversity, they are also some of the biggest polluters in terms of plastics ending up in the ocean. We also talked about human rights abuses that are frequently occur in offshore industrial tuna fisheries. The fact that modern day slavery is tolerated at all in supply chains, which are given sustainability accreditation by certification schemes, is inexcusable. Add to this the fact that many of these industrial fisheries have been built on the back of harmful fishery subsidies and are still benefiting from capacity enhancing subsidies such as vessel construction and fuel subsidies. And it becomes clear how difficult it is for small-scale tuna fisheries to compete with these large offshore fisheries. This relates to their access to fishing grounds and fishing rights, and also to their access to markets. We obviously have to do better. Business as usual is no longer good enough. We need to shift towards sustainable development goal aligned nature positive fisheries. Thriving coastal areas, a resilient deep ocean, abundant nature and protected high seas will help sustain all humankind and support the culture and well-being of indigenous people and coastal communities. A healthy ocean is fundamental to a healthy planet and makes a hopeful future for current and future generations possible. So what can we do? We think that tuna fishing needs to be radically rethought, and the status quo of industrial fisheries need to be disrupted in support of small-scale, socially and environmentally responsible fisheries that can contribute to sustainable development, which leaves no one behind. That brings me to our theme today, Reimagine Tuna. With this initiative, we are launching a long-running campaign, forming a coalition of like-minded organizations who want to see more radical change to the tuna fishing sector, stepping away from profit-driven industrial fisheries towards environmentally and socially responsible fisheries that put coastal communities and environmental sustainability first. We believe urgent action is required. Now is the time to limit destructive fishing methods and promote environmentally sustainable and socially responsible fisheries that have been part of the culture and history of the communities that depend on these resources. We call on you to join us as we reimagine tuna. We want you to collaborate with us so that we can work together on finding solutions rather than just pointing fingers. We also believe that the Reimagine Tuna initiative can be a blueprint for other small-scale fisheries to follow. Sustainability cannot be achieved unless we place nature on the path to recovery. We need to transform our world to one where people, economies, and nature thrive together, and where livelihoods are secured so that no one is left behind. Please get in touch so that you can be part of reimagining what the future could and should look like. Thank you very much.